I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Eliot Schrefer, best-selling author and National Book Award finalist. Eliot, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, and I am incredibly honored to be with both of you today, which, Justin, that's quite a testament to the power of Bearboy. I devoured this book, and I can't wait to have our conversation around it. I've written works around young people and animals and their relationships together. Dr. Goodall blurbed one, rescued a number of years back. And I'm also part of the animal studies program at New York University. So without further ado, I would love to introduce the two of you. Justin, we're going to talk more about your background because this is a memoir and we'll find out about your life, but you are a TV producer and animal activist, and we'll get deep into it. Dr. Goodall, it seems silly to even introduce you because you're one of probably the 5 people in the world that actually truly does need no introduction, but you are a UN messenger of peace. And more importantly to me, you have done more than any individual to force us to recognize what bonds us to the non-human world, and your work has changed the scientific world and the world of all humanity and animals because of that. And I know you're also a fan of Johnny Walker whiskey, which is near to my heart as well. And you're both terrific writers and terrific advocates for animals. So let's start the conversation. Justin, I was wondering if you could start us off by just describing what Bearboy is about and how you came to write it, and just introduce us to the book a little bit.
Of course, yeah. Bearboy is a true story of, when I was a young person, 13 years old, I actually discovered a book about animal rights, and I can now say that book changed my life. The second I read the chapter about that meat was animals, I went vegetarian, and then I landed on a chapter about the tragedy of zoos and how captivity impacts animals. And that started what is now has been a lifelong journey to stand up for animals, and particularly animals in captivity. And so this book is about my youth, about the years when I was from like 13 to 17. I got a letter from a woman who said there's these 2 bears, Brutus and Ursula, living in terrible conditions. Can you do something? And I took that cause up, and these 2 bears were living in a cage. They'd been neglected for 20 years. And the story is really about that. It's really about me discovering the bears and then what I did to help them. And so that's what it's about. And I've spent 10 years writing it. I started writing it 10 years ago. That's been its own journey to actually write the story. So to have this book in the world and have Jane, to have you have written the foreword and now joining me for the launch, it's all very surreal. It's such an honor to be in this moment after both the journey of helping Brutus and Ursula and to tell this story. So what a moment. Thank you both.
Dr. Goodall, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your history with Justin and how you came to write the foreword. And over the years, I know you've had many relationships with young people and been a big supporter, but how did you enter Justin's world in the story of Brutus and Ursula?
Well, I think, and Justin, you can correct me, I think you wrote me a letter. Is that right? Did you write me a letter?
You wrote me a postcard. I think that you found a news article about me and wrote me a postcard when I was 14. Right. Yeah.
There was an article about you and about these poor bears in this horrible situation and what you were trying to do. And I thought, this is the kind of young person that is so important in the world today, somebody to speak out for animals. So yes, I remember I wrote you a postcard. You actually showed it to me when I met you a little while later, and so supported you on your, really, you never gave up on those bears. And I think we wrote to each other a couple of times during that long fight, and you won. And so, I knew that you were somebody who was very important.
Justin, could you tell us a little bit about that fight? Like, what were the steps that you took to ultimately save Brutus and Ursula?
Yeah, it started when I first showed up to Brutus and Ursula's cage. They were living on the side of a creek that flooded every year. And Ursula, when animals are kept in captivity, they kind of have this behavior where they start pacing a lot. And Ursula would just pace around this cage that was not much bigger than a shipping container. And she'd slip when she turned the corner on the algae that had kind of developed on the cage. It was just terrible. And they were getting fed monkey food. So the first thing I did was I started talking to them, calling the mayor of this city where these bears were kept, and saying they need better food. We need to put dirt on the ground so they're not living on concrete. And they weren't very responsive to even those basic things until the news got involved. I started kind of sharing the story with the local news, and then I was able to leverage the news to get the city to start making changes. And I quickly learned that improving their cage was not going to be the solution. We actually needed to get the bears out of there. And the only way to really describe it was I was obsessed. I became obsessed. Every waking hour was dedicated to those bears. And essentially, I searched the country and found a sanctuary, a Folsom Zoo sanctuary that was about 20 minutes from the bears. And they said, well, funny thing, we just finished, building this new exhibit for the mountain lions, and now we're going to move on to the bears. Maybe we can bring the bears here. And I was like, oh my God, amazing. But there was a catch. $250,000 had to be raised. So that was what the journey really started, the fundraising and bringing the plight to both the local and national media. And for me, their journey and bringing this story to the media was more about Brutus and Ursula. They were the kind of examples of the conversation I really wanted to have around the challenges of captivity for animals. And that was really important to me. Saving these bears were important, but also that they were just an example of how animals struggle in zoos and captivity. So that's the journey.
There's an amazing line in the book where you say, I learned that there are two kinds of adults, ones who believe in kids and ones who don't. I had a whole Rolodex of people who believed in me. So when you were really in a struggling moment, you knew which adults you could turn to. And of course, one of those was Dr. Goodall. And Dr. Goodall, one of the things I love about pictures that are taken with you and young activists or young people who care about animals is that you're usually looking at the young person, and then they're looking at the camera. And it's just so clear how much love and support you feel for young people who are fighting this way. And I just wondered what you might have learned through examples like Justin about the kind of animal advocacy that works coming from the young, or what the journey is often like for them.
Well, the kind of advocacy that works is when young people like Justin are actually passionate about what they're doing. And they're doing it because their heart is telling them to. And very often, I think, they have supportive parents. And I don't remember, Justin, did you have supportive parents?
Yeah, the part of the journey was they were always supportive, but it was the 90s and they weren't too supportive of the $400 phone bills that would come in because I was on the phone constantly.
I remember that. Yes, I remember that. You telling me your parents didn't like all these telephone calls.
You needed to be on the NCI 10 cents a minute plan, right? I think that was existed in the 90s, if I remember right.
That wasn't enough.
Well, it's a testament to how hard you were working. I mean, it's amazing. It comes through in the book loud and clear how passionate you were about this. And Dr. Goodall, I know your mother went into Tanzania with you when you were first entering Gombe after Louis Leakey gave you your charge. What was the impact of having a supportive parent for you in the early years of your work?
Well, actually, I was born loving animals. And when I was a very tiny little child, I remember my mother telling me, I mean, obviously I don't remember this, but she said, Jane, I came to your room to say goodnight to you. And there you were, looking into your bed with such concentration. And I looked, what were you looking at? A whole lot of wriggling earthworms that I'd taken to bed with me. And she said, it looked as though you're wondering, how do they walk without legs? Well, anyway, she told me that they'd die if we left them there. We took them back in the garden. But most mothers would have just said, how dare you bring all this dirty worms and earth into your bed? She didn't. And it was like that my whole childhood. And when I dreamed of going to Africa, aged 10, everybody laughed at me. We didn't have money. The war was raging. I was just a girl. And I should dream about something that I could achieve. Not, Mum, if you really want to do this, you have to work really hard, take advantage of opportunity. And if you don't give up, you'll probably find a way. So the story of how I got to Gombe is immaterial, but when finally Leakey had invited me to study chimps, there were two big problems. One, he had to get money for me to start, and I hadn't been to college. But he finally did. He got money for 6 months. Second problem, at that time, what's now Tanzania was Tanganyika. It was a crumbling outpost of the British Empire. And the British authorities were absolutely not prepared to allow a young English girl. Crazy idea. Back then, this was 1957 when he began trying to get money. What a stupid idea. They're not taking responsibility for this. But in the end, because Lewis insisted, they said, all right, but she must have a companion. So who volunteered to come? That same amazing mother. So it emphasizes, in my mind, the tremendous importance of having supportive parents. And I think so many of the young people who've succeeded have had supportive parents. And those who succeed without supportive parents have usually had some mentor who supported them, because that's what young people need, somebody to believe in them.
Justin, in your book, it really comes through how many times, even though your parents didn't understand your urge to help, your such strong urge to help these animals, there was also so many times that they did come through and support you and find ways to understand you and help you. But
absolutely. And I had tons of mentors. Jane, you're right, that I had so many amazing adults who either it was the therapist who was helping me with my adolescent mind, or it was, old school animal activists who were helping me navigate the politics of the zoo industry, whatever it was. I could have never, ever done what I did without mentors. And I think that's one of the most important things for young people and young activists, is to find the support, because social change is hard. Pushing up against well-established norms isn't easy. So like, we really, young people in particular, all activists, anyone that wants to create change, like mentorship is really, really, really something that I think is important. It's had a huge impact on my life.
One thing that comes in so strong about both your stories is the impact of books as mentors and as models for change. I know, Justin, you already mentioned the 101 Ways to Save Animals, how important that book was for you. And reading your letters, Dr. Goodall, you mentioned reading Enid Blyton and really loving the parts that were about books and about animals in her books when you were a child. And my mom's your exact age and also English, and she adores Enid Blyton as well. And so it was interesting to see how books had such a big impact for both of you. And Justin, now you've made one that will also impact young activists. I was curious if we could return to the idea of youth activism. And often it seems like children are told to just change their own behaviors, like turn off the lights more or start a recycling program. You're both examples of people who went way beyond that as far as your engagement with the natural world. So I was curious if you could talk about like the forms of youth activism, and they're all important, but how can we support young people? And in the writing of this book, Justin, how did you learn about what young people need to really make change?
When I look around these days, there are so many young people that are engaged in the world, and they are like, we all have a lot to learn from what they're doing. And I'm always moved, like looking around and seeing how much change young people are creating these days, and have always, but these days it's in particular are leading so many fights, and so I'm really moved by that. But I will say that I think that one of the most powerful things I did early on was something very personal. Was to when I learned about the state of animal agriculture and what happens to create meat. That very first step of going vegetarian was profoundly moving for me because it was such a personal choice that has such a big impact. And I would say that like, how do we find the things that we all, how do we make decisions every day in our lives that impact people and animals? I think that's a really great step as activists. And mentorship, like I said, is really important. Like I think that is super important, and just knowing, like having a vision. Like the bears, I'm often learning from my younger self that I never second guessed that the bears were going to get moved from that cage. And like having that like vision and just moving forward and celebrating the small steps was really important. And like the one thing I've learned over the years is that like what we're not in control of is the timing of these things. That social change takes a lot, but knowing that like I want to be an optimist and really believe that like the big systematic changes that we all hope for are on the horizon, but we all need to keep taking those steps in that direction. And that's what I really hoped to share in this book, was that like optimism of like anything that we can dream of is possible.
Dr. Goodall, what's your relationship, or how has it evolved over the years between you and vegetarianism, or the eating of animals, or more broadly, personal choices that we all can make?
Well, again, books. It was in the late 1980s? No, 70s. Wait a minute. Went to Gombe in the late 1960s that I read Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. I didn't know about factory farms. In England, there weren't any when I went to Gombe. And the next time I saw a piece of meat on my plate was actually on a plane from Nairobi in Africa to London. It was a bit of chicken, I think. And I looked at it and I thought, now I know this is symbolic of fear, pain, death. And from that moment on, I stopped eating meat. Since I've been grounded here during the pandemic, I've managed to become vegan. It's not easy when you're on the road. It's not easy when you're traveling 300 days a year. I've tried to be as vegan as I could, but it's tough. You need your own plane and your own chef and all that kind of stuff. But at least minimizing the consumption of animal products. And so that's how that's how I came to understand about factory farming and all the rest of it. But the big fight I had, which was similar to yours, Justin, with the bears, was when I saw how chimpanzees were treated in medical research laboratories. Closest living relatives who are very social, who have amazing lives in the wild. Now they're in 5 foot by 5 foot cages with steel bars all around, worse than your bears even. And they may be there for 30, 40, 50 years because they can live 60 years. And it was a big shock. And so I began that fight. But I was fortunate, and I think it was my mother's influence, that I knew I had to go into a lab. I'd seen the footage secretly filmed, but I knew I had to get into a lab and see with my own eyes to speak about it and to fight for it in a proper way. And when I came out from going around the lab. I don't know why they let me in, but they did. And I found that all the head people from National Institutes of Health were sitting around the table. And I sat there and I was dazed, I was emotional, and tears in my eyes. And I realized they were waiting for me to speak. What was I going to say? So I said, whatever was put into my mind. I imagine you're all caring and compassionate people. And so you must feel rather as I do about what's going on in there. But I didn't attack them. And I think that's a mistake that young activists sometimes make. Instead, I talk to them about how chimps behave in the wild, the amazing lives, they're grooming each other. Yes, they can be brutal, but I didn't dwell on that. And so in their minds, they were comparing the two. And you have to realize that some people literally don't understand. They literally are not educated enough to understand the harm that they're causing. So it's taken a long time and many other groups getting involved and helping, but in the end we got all chimps in America out of medical research and into sanctuary. But gosh, it's taken a long time.
Mm-hmm.
You don't give up.
How long did it take?
What?
How long did it take?
Well, I started in 1987 or 8, and finally we got the last ones out thanks to the new director of NIH, who's Francis Collins, who's a geneticist, who I happened to meet at a dinner when he was just newly in the thing, and I started talking to him about the chimps. This is like 8-10 years ago. And he said, well, Jane, I don't know about chimps. I'm a geneticist. He unraveled the human genome. So I told him about chimps. So he put together a team of NIH people, and they took 18 months, and they went round, they didn't go there, but they investigated every single test being done with 2 questions. Is this beneficial to human health? Potentially beneficial. And after 18 months, not one single test being done was either beneficial or potential. So he said, right, sanctuary. Mm. And he made many enemies within the NIH as a result.
Mm. One thing that jumps out is how your rhetorical techniques, Dr. Goodall, were like to empathize in that moment instead of just excoriating the scientists who were there at the chimpanzee lab. And it comes out in Bearboy too, Justin. I was so impressed with, especially as a teenager, the techniques you were able to come up with in order to help. Like there was a passage where you talk about how you read hundreds of articles about the plight of zoo animals, but also solutions, that you were hungry to be able to suggest solutions to the owners of the zoo, not just make the complaint loud enough that they could hear it, but to actually find ways that they could act on it, like if they didn't have ideas of how to do it. And I was so struck. You said you're only a photocopy away from helping ease their pain, like by photocopying all these articles. And that really jumped out. But the sort of seeing your piece of chicken on the flight, Dr. Goodall, made me think of a moment in Justin's book where you had used to, I was also a child of the 90s, and you talk about how you loved watching Double Dare on Nickelodeon with all the green goop and challenges. And I also loved that show. But you talk about how you used to love watching it. And then after seeing the bears, what was just you say what was so entertaining a year ago now felt shallow and useless. The green slime the entire family was covered in as they jumped up and down celebrating their win made me think about the algae that Ursula spent her days slipping on as she paced around her cage. What am I doing? I clicked off the TV and went to the kitchen to call Doris, who was someone you were working with to get help for the animals. So I wanted to talk more broadly about like captivity and how it, what arguments there are on either side and what you've learned about animals in captivity. I don't know if Justin, if you want to start with any thoughts you have about the uses or.
Sure. Yeah, I think that for too long there's been a false conversation about zoos. I think that there are certainly some great leaders in the zoo industry. Oakland Zoo in particular. I think that there's some management that's good. But I think overall, the zoo industry needs to be changed, because there's this idea that keeping animals bred in captivity and building captive populations is conservation. And I really believe that the more that we can actually be preserving, natural habitats and funneling our energies in that direction is what conservation looks like. And I think for me, I have a 2-year-old son, Noah, and I want to teach him about the natural world. And it sure would be easy for me to take him to the zoo, but that's not how I want him to learn about nature. I want him to understand what the lives of free animals are and what they look like, what it's like to be living in nature. And I really think that we need to be thinking twice about the role that zoos play in our world, because I certainly think there's an opportunity for them to be playing a real substantial role in conservation. But right now it's a lot of marketing hype, and I was on the news the other night for the book, and right before that, the story about about Bearboy, there was a story about baby wolves in a Mexican zoo, and the public really loves baby animals and loves that story, but then we don't actually see the full story, because oftentimes those babies turn into adolescents, get transferred to another zoo, families are separated. It's the full story of the zoo industry is pretty tragic. And so I think there's an opportunity to actually really rethink it. But the state of most zoos and particularly the US zoo industry there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room for improvement. And that's, for me, that's really why I believe I'm here, is to see that change. And that's partly why I came out with Bearboy, was because I wanted to restart this conversation. And luckily the conversation's being had. There's more and more conversations about, is it morally right to keep animals in captivity? And so certainly we want to be part of that conversation and that change that is possible.
Dr. Goodall, thoughts on captivity and the future of zoos?
Yes, I've been working with zoos for many, many years, trying to improve conditions. And there's absolutely no question in my mind that the really good zoos are doing an awful lot for conservation. They employ veterinarians who learn a lot about animal disease from working in the zoo. Now, the good zoos are putting a large percentage of their money into conservation efforts of their animals out in the wild. They're sending veterinarians out there to share their knowledge, to treat the animals and to leave their knowledge behind. They're doing fabulous work in education, materials for children, talking about how the animals live in the wild. They're no good zoo, and there are too many bad zoos. There's way too many bad zoos, but no good zoo will bring in animals from the wild unless it's to rescue them from some horrible situation. And I think the last thing that I want to say about this is, there's this beautiful vision of animals living their lives in the wild. But I've spent so much time in the wild. And if you're a chimpanzee and you're living in an area, you hear the chainsaws getting closer, or the bulldozers cutting down the trees, and you're living in fear, and you try to move away, but you then go into the territory of another chimp group and you probably get attacked and killed. And so living in the natural world isn't always wonderful. And it really came to me the other day. It was about 5 years ago, and I was in one of the better zoos. They can all improve, and the zoo people know that. And the enrichment is so important, giving the animals something to do. But anyway, I was in one of the better zoos, and there was a chimp group, and there were 2 males grooming each other, 3 females kind of lying around, young ones playing, sun moving down. They were soon ready to go in and get their evening meal. And they had lots of enrichment, like, they had to work to get their food, artificial termite mounds, all those things I invented way back when, and lots more that have been invented since. And then I compared it with some of the chimpanzees in, being caught in wire snares, losing a hand or a foot, being shot for bushmeat, babies wounded, we have to rescue them. And I thought, well, now let me be honest. If I was a chimp, and I don't really know how chimps think, but looking at chimps in these two situations, I don't think I'd be very upset to be living in this zoo. So it's zoos and zoos, zoos getting better, zoos putting more money into conservation, zoos using their knowledge, their veterinary knowledge and so on, to help the people fighting on the ground in the field. And educating. I know so many people who've said, well, I went into animal conservation because of my experience in a zoo. I knew I wanted to help them. So there's bad zoos, which should be closed. There's better zoos that can get better. And there's one or two really good zoos.
Thank you. And just unless you have something to comment on that, Justin, I have one final question that I would like to ask both of you, and then we'll turn to audience questions. I know there's a couple already in there. But one thing I was struck about reading Bearboy, Justin, is how you capture the experience of being a teenager. The writing is so wonderful in the book. Like, it is a really great YA book, as well as an important memoir of an animal activist. One of the moments you have is you say, my heart sank at the idea of animals being snatched from their families in Africa and brought to terrible places like the valley. So it wasn't just being in the zoo. It was like, they have to live in the valley like I do, like this in this place. And it seemed like there was it helped to sort of access what the wellspring is potentially of your incredible radical empathy for animals. And as someone who wants to see more radical empathy for animals, I was wondering if both of you might talk about sort of what do you think in your lives led you to be the person who could make such extraordinary differences in animal lives? Like, what was your foundation that brought you to these amazing acts of empathy and compassion?
I don't know. I think that from a very young age, I mean, to be real honest, from a very young age, since I can remember, I remember being amazed by what you did, Jane. I remember people asking me they ask kids who your heroes, and the story of you going into the wild and then coming out and telling the story of dramatically changing the way humans think about animals, that was really moving to me. And I do think in the process of writing this book, I didn't really realize this at the time, but I really realized that the struggles I faced as a young person, as a young queer person, hidden away, with my identity, struggling with my identity, in a place that I just felt, I was bullied and things just were tough. Like, I was really able to empathize with the same kind of containment that zoo animals face. So that was really why I think I resonated with the animals in zoos, was I felt also I was not contained, but I maybe mentally contained or contained by stereotypes. And so that's, I think, really, I always, from a very young age, really believed in environmentalism and loved animals. So I don't know where that came from, but I definitely know the second I learned that I could actually do something for animals was what changed my life and helped me not just help other animals, but also help myself. And that's one of the missions for the book. Is I like to say that this book is about my hope that kids and young people and everyone stands up for themselves and for their fellow earthlings. And that's that's how this story impacted my life. And I hope to kind of spread that message.
Well, I think it will. And I know I'm grateful, and I know your readers will be. Dr. Goodall, do you have thoughts on the sources of radical empathy, whether yours or broadly?
I don't know. I was born with it. I mean, I literally was born loving animals. And when I got to Cambridge, I'd been with the chimps for 1.5 years. I'd never been to college, but Leakey told me I had to get a PhD because I would have to stand on my own 2 feet. And he said, there's no time to mess about with a BA. When I got to Cambridge, I was told by these professors, of whom I was really nervous, I'd done everything wrong. Chimpanzees shouldn't have names. They should have numbers. That's scientific. You can't talk about them having personalities, minds capable of problem solving, or emotions, because those are unique to us. But I had a wonderful teacher when I was a child who taught me that in this respect, these erudite professors were totally and completely wrong. There he is, Rusty. And so I was able to stand up for my beliefs, which my mother had always taught me to do, not by confronting anyone, but just by going on talking, telling stories, writing things the way they were. And then my husband was taking video, or it was film in those days. And when that started circulating, people, the scientists, had to change. And, you know, chimps are our closest living relative. That was the luck I had to be with them, because biologically they're so like us. And I was showing how behaviorally they're so like us. And that's what changed everything. But it was not just Rusty and my mother. It was books, back to books. Dr. Dolittle. Justin, you've read Dr. Dolittle, have you? Yes.
Of course.
And he took circus animals back to Africa. I loved it. He learned animal language. I wanted to learn. This is when I was 8. And then when I was 10, I found a little book, Tarzan of the Apes, and fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And goodness gracious me, what did he do? He married the wrong Jane. I was so jealous. That's where my dream began. You know, I've never seen a Tarzan movie. My mother saved up and took me to one of, it was in the war, we weren't seeing movies. But after the war, she saved up. We didn't have much money. And it was Johnny Weissmuller. And after about 10 minutes, apparently, I burst into tears. She had to take me out. What's the matter? That wasn't Tarzan. Because we had our imagination back then. We weren't deluged with other people's televised impression of who the person was. So it was my mother, my dog, and Dr. Dolittle and Tarzan. That's what, really took me to Africa.
One of the things that's so striking in your books, Dr. Goodall is just one of them pulled off the shelf, but is how you do track the chimpanzees' lives in such emotionally rich detail that it's like a Shakespearean drama. You see the rise and fall of heroes and villains, and I'm struck by the fact that I think it's because you named these chimps that you were able to track their stories as important characters, non-human characters, and that if you had numbered them like science wanted you to do, that you might have been harder to track those compelling journeys.
There was a very interesting sidelight on that. Do you remember the story of Cecil the Lion, who was shot by a trophy hunter, that dentist? Well, because Cecil had a name, people immediately related to it. And there was this outcry, this outpouring of rage and anger. But the point is that all the other bears that Fish and Wildlife insist are numbered. None of them are named. Even the famous 399, who's now just raised 4 cubs healthily for a whole year. If they had names, people would relate to them so much more.
It's another way, yeah.
It's a long fight, but we're getting there.
One other way that we try to keep the human sacred, right? And that names are for humans and animals don't get them, right?
Yes, we're different.
Justin, there's a question from the audience for you if you're willing to answer some questions. That Ruth Millington wants to know, would you have done anything different if this had happened to you and the bears in today's world instead of in the 90s?
Wow, I mean, it was so much easier just to get the local news and the national news to cover it. We have a whole other world of social media, and I certainly think that this story of Brutus and Ursula would have gone on fire on social media, but in today, I think it was those early days before all of the, technology and everything. I don't know what I would have changed today. That's a really good question. I certainly would have liked to keep in touch with all the people who donated money. Thousands and thousands of people contributed, and maybe in social media I would have been able to keep those folks, like it could have been kind of a community, but they just sent letters at the time. So maybe that's what I would have changed. It would have been really special to see the profiles of all these amazing people that helped me raise the thousands and thousands of dollars for those bears.
Certainly there would have been fewer fights with your parents about the phone bill.
For sure.
Just Skype.
Yeah, right.
And there would be fewer Spice Girls references, which would be a tragedy for us all.
True.
There's another question from the audience that I think is a really great one to tackle for both of you. Wendy B says, activism can be very taxing. Can you suggest ways to stay in balance while fighting for wildlife? Dr. Goodall, do you have any thoughts about how to prevent it from burnout?
Well, I'm in my 88th year and I haven't burned out yet. And I don't intend to because I'm very passionate. So I think the answer is to live in the moment, not to think that you can change everything right now. That change has to come, in stages. And you can't, like some young activists today, they're quite aggressive and they'll point a finger at somebody and say, you've got to stop doing this, you've got to stop now. It doesn't work that way. And I learned that from this long fight about the lab chimps. So all the time, incrementally, we were improving the conditions in the labs. They let me send somebody in to provide enrichment for these poor chimps. It wasn't what I wanted, but you cannot make change just like that. And I think if you think you're going to make change just like that, that's when you'll burn out because it won't happen.
Justin, do you have thoughts on preventing burnout?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that having aspirations and inspirations to what the future can look like, but I think Dr. Jane and I are similar, take one step forward for change and eventually we land at the destination that we hope for. And I'll say that when I was 13, I was one of those kids with my family about vegetarianism. I would definitely, one of my favorite lines of the book was no quoting PETA at the dinner table to my dad. And that was my dad's quote because I would often talk about how horrible, meat was and how dare you eat meat. And I really do believe that living by example and not pointing fingers and just living your truth and sharing your knowledge and letting people be on their own journey, I think is really important personally. But I certainly think that that knowing that not everything is going to happen overnight when we're thinking about social change, but knowing that it will happen.
It will happen. Keep the goal.
Yeah.
I always say, if you aim for the stars, you might reach the moon. If you aim for the moon, you'll just get to the top of Everest. So let's start with the stars and realize that, we will get to the moon. And from there, maybe we can climb higher.
Yeah. Amazing.
We actually have a related question. It's very appropriate for Father's Day here in the United States. And Jenny Nash notices that Justin spoke so movingly about his son. What can parents do who have a child chomping at the bit to change the world? Kids often feel like they have so little power. How can a parent empower them?
I think back to books. I think there's so many ways. I think storytelling is a massive opportunity to inspire people that, both Jane and I were inspired by stories. And that's the amazing things about books is that they kind of take you beyond what is possible, see that there's other bigger ideas out there. So I do think that there's, I think that like finding books that inspire, I think that is a very good start. And finding, I have a whole lineup of amazing books that help young people. My 2-year-old son, it's not about animal rights, but it's about compassion and empathy towards animals. So I do think that that's a great starting point, is finding stories to help inspire people and your young ones. And I think that that's that one way to start. And then just let your, for me, my son's vegetarian, maybe he won't be one day. So like not being too like strict about things, like kind of guiding your young folks in the direction, but letting them uncover what they're passionate about. And maybe my son will never be passionate about animal rights, and that's okay. And he'll love something else. But that's, but I think like teaching compassion and then being, hoping that they go off and find the thing that they love, whatever that is certainly is my recommendation for that.
Dr. Goodall, thoughts about how we empower youth?
No, just the same. I mean, not pushing. I mean, your child may not have the aspirations you have, because they're all different. We're all individuals, and they can change too. So I have a nephew, a great nephew actually, my sister's grandson. And when he was 4, he decided he'd be a vegetarian. He couldn't say the word properly, vegetarian. And he would go with his mother to the supermarket and tell her she couldn't buy this and that. And he was passionate. And then when he got mixed up with teenagers, he changed. Now he's eating meat and smoking cigarettes, which is really sad. But you would never have predicted it from how he was when he was young. My son was the opposite. He grew up on the lake shore in Tanganyika, Tanzania. And his hero was a fisherman. So he fished. And for a while he did some commercial fishing, which I hated. He didn't say anything. Well, now he's completely turned around. And an interview the other day, he said, I'm supporting my mum and supporting her desire to protect the natural world, which she's doing. So if you try and push the child into doing something that child doesn't want to do, they're going to rebel against you, I think. So Mum supported me all through my childhood. Whatever I did, she always supported me. And my sister too.
Well, this is a wonderful example of a work of literature that is also going to help support so many people. I know so many people in this event are inspired by Bearboy and are eager to get it into young people's hands and old people. Everyone could be reading it. And I do hope that when you buy your copy that you go to an independent bookstore. They've had a really, really difficult year and a half. And it's amazing that they are still around and getting books into people's hands. And so just to help support them and thank them for finding ways to make it through this pandemic by hook and by crook is a great way to support Justin's work, Dr. Goodall's work, and also the bookstores like Books of Wonder, who I see is back on screen. Hello.
Thank you so much for that, Eliot. And thank you so much, Dr. Goodall, for joining us. It's been such an honor. I know you had an out time, so I don't want to keep you, but I also don't want to kick you out if you're able to stay around for a few more minutes.
I'm able to stay around for 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, fabulous. I had one question. I'm going to put our moderator, Eliot, on the spot, since we were talking about how inspiring books and nature writing can be for young people. Eliot, you have a number of really inspiring conservation books across ages. Could you tell us a little bit about some of your titles?
Oh gosh, I thought I was in this comfort zone of just asking the questions and not having to answer. It's like selecting someone to be on the spot. Now I'm on the spot. So for years, I did not write about animals and conservation, and I did not have a real childhood awakening the way that both Dr. Goodall and Justin had. What happened to me was I bought a pair of pants that were Bonobos brand. It's a kind of khakis. And I thought it was a nonsense word. And I looked up bonobos and I discovered the species of ape that I had never heard of that were hugely inspiring to me, that were matriarchal, peace-loving, and I was upset that I hadn't already known about them. And so I read a book called Bonobo Handshake. It's about a primatologist's experience in Congo, spending time with them. And I wound up going to Congo to research the bonobos and wrote a novel about them called Endangered, about a 13-year-old girl in Congo who survives wartime with an orphan ape by her side. But it awakened, it was like that moment of looking at the chicken on the flight, Dr. Goodall. It's like it awakened a question that had always been there, but I hadn't allowed myself to answer, because I figured if this question was legitimate, all humans should stop what they're doing and behaving the way that they are and be someone else entirely. That we are doing incredible injustice to the animal world, and that someone must have thought about it and realized there's some great good we're doing by eating animals and imprisoning them. And I realized, like in reading this memoir and doing my research, that that's actually not true, and that we all need help lifting the veil and seeing what we're doing and how it impacts the natural world. And so it changed my writing life entirely, because that was a skill set I had to tell stories. And so I switched to telling stories that work on muddying that line between the human and the non-human, and reminding us of what bonds us to the natural world, and hopefully leaving young people with a feeling of hope. So there was one book, Rescued, Dr. Goodall, I don't know if you remember, but it's about a boy who grows up with an orangutan as a brother, and winds up going on a road trip to try to get him back to Indonesia because he's been smuggled into the US. And you were so kind to blurb it, and you actually also gave us some editorial feedback, which went above and beyond anything I would have expected. So your empathy towards animals is matched by your empathy to young writers like Justin and me. So
that this pandemic that we're still in the jaws of is entirely caused by our disrespect of animals, creating conditions where pathogens can jump from an animal to human and create a new disease. So it's coming back to harm us, this disrespect that we have. Mm-hmm. And books, as you say, storytelling, it does get to people. It's so important.
So before we wrap up, I just want to ask Justin and Dr. Jane, if you could just, one thing that you would like everybody watching, everybody in the audience to take home with them or to go out and do today. Is there one thing that you would have?
Who are you asking?
You, first of all.
Okay. Well, I would ask people to check out Roots and Shoots. Roots and Shoots is a program that I began in '91 for young people. Began with 12 high school students in Tanzania. It's now in 87, 88 countries, kindergarten, university, everything in between. And the main message, which is the message I want to give, that each one of us matters. Each one of us has a role to play. Each one of us makes some impact on the planet every single day. And we have a choice as to what kind of impact we make. So every group of Roots and Shoots choose themselves. We don't dictate to them, and you can't, because they're so different. The projects they choose, one to help people, one to help animals, one to help the environment, will depend on how old they are, the kind of environment they live in, if they're rich or poor, the kind of politics of their country. But it's spreading and it's changing lives. And I think, Justin, you know about Roots and Shoots, don't you? So
of course.
Yes. So I would beg people to look up Roots and Shoots and either join or start a group, because it is changing young people's lives everywhere. And we're right across China. We're going fast in the UAE. We're spreading through South America. And one of the big pushes is understand animals.
And the most amazing thing about Roots and Shoots is how it's all of those programs are interconnected, that the lives of humans and the environment and animals, we're not different. We're all impacted. And that's one of the unique things about Roots and Shoots from my perspective, is how it's not just raising activists and raising people to believe, young people to believe in their power, but it's also looking at our world as a whole. It's such a holistic program. And I love that about Roots and Shoots.
And Justin, if you had just one single call to action for everybody watching today, that they can go out and do today or tomorrow.
I really believe that writing books and storytelling is activism. And like, while I would love for people to buy this book, I found a book about animal rights at a used bookstore. So one thing I would absolutely love anyone that's tuning in to do is obviously support Books of Wonder, but more importantly for me is to call your local library. Because I really want the next young person to be inspired, and I hope that Bearboy inspires people. And so to be able to find this book in places that, in the library, used bookstores, that's like one thing I'd really love folks to do, is to make sure that it's accessible to young people. So that's, as the person who's bringing out a book next week, is where my head's at, is what I will say. And also, please think about a vegetarian or vegan diet. That is like one, please explore that idea.
Call it a plant-based diet, because that's where we need to move towards.
Mm-hmm.
The book is Bearboy, the true story of a boy, two bears, and the fight to be free. It is inspiring, it is moving, it is frequently funny. It is a really wonderful memoir for all ages by Justin Barker. You can get your copy from Books of Wonder on our website, or if you are in Manhattan, you can stop by one of our locations. There is a link in the chat, as well as at the bottom of your screen. Again, that's by Justin Barker with a foreword by Dr. Jane Goodall. And we do have a signed book plate. So each copy does come with your autographed book plate. Very fancy. We are so delighted and so honored to have hosted this event today with Eliot Schrefer, with Justin Barker, with Dr. Jane Goodall. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone in the audience, for coming out on this Father's Day. We appreciate you all so much. And now I am going to ask each of our authors to wave goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.